So today we have a wonderful show for you. It's really a long time been waiting for us to do this particular segment. It's really awesome. I had a lot of questions from people who have asked about it from the past shows that we did on health. So today we have really important topic, as you guys know, how to take our seats at the table, the importance of diversity in clinical trials. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get us started with our prayer. Father, Lord Almighty, we gather here in your presence. Everyone who's here is created by you, whether they're following a different type of religion, and all sorts of issues and concerns that we have may derail us away from you, Father. But we know that when we are closer to you, whether we call you God, or the universe, the heavens, whatever in which way, or Allah, Father, please, we want to hear from you. We want you to direct our thoughts right here to be able to educate. For this is an avenue, a platform that we want to be able to educate everyone and be able to give a really good hope for any issue going on. The issue we're going to discuss today is how come we can't trust anymore to be able to participate in diversity in clinical trials. We know what have happened in the past, but could we, just like everything else that we have in our life that disappoint us, could we give it a try one more time? And most importantly, Father, can we, within the diverse communities, especially the Africans, the Black community, can you raise the mantles and institutions that will be able to carry out the research and clinical trials within us? Father, we ask all this for the best and the best of humanity to be out there. For where everyone gains, we are happy. Thank you so much, Almighty Father, for taking over, for you are in charge all the time. In Jesus' mighty name, we pray as Christians. Amen. I'm going to go ahead and take this moment to have our wonderful two guests to introduce themselves. I know them very well. I know Dr. Terrell very well. I'm so grateful that she brought along Dr. Wynn, who is here as well with us. Dr. Terrell, let me go ahead and start with you. Why don't you tell the audience who you are, please?
Good afternoon, morning, evening, whatever suits where you are. I am Daria Terrell. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I also happen to be chairman of the Department of Surgery at St. Bernard Hospital, and I'm also medical director of clinical programming and health outcomes at the hospital. And I am very happy to be a part of this discussion today because I think it is a very, very important topic. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm very appreciative to BB for allowing and offering this invitation to participate today.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Terrell has been a wonderful supporter of this program, and we are very proud of him and look forward to continuing to do a whole lot of work with her in the future as the Lord permits and as her schedule permits too. And without further ado, let's go ahead and bring in Dr. Wynn, Robert A. Wynn, who's the director at VCA. Dr. Wynn, could you tell us a bit about you?
Yeah, so I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be in your presence today. I am currently the second ever African-American cancer center director in the country to run what's called an NCI designated or a federally designated cancer center. We are one of 71 in the country. This program has been around for the last 50 years. It got established under the Nixon administration to part of its war on cancer. Understanding this, I also understand my role and understand that being number two doesn't make me feel comfortable. So I'm also glad that to be an advocate for Dr. Oduni, who is at the University of Chicago, who is now the third Black person to take the reins of a federally designated cancer center. So it's with that humility that I come before you to talk about not so much about what it is that my title is, but what my mission and what my goal of service is. And hopefully through conversations tonight, we can even enhance what the service of making sure that our folk are getting the best access to the best possible care. And these days, unlike 1950, which I'll talk about, but unlike 1950, 1960s, we now think that clinical trials actually are not an experiment, but a standard and a continuum of care. And that we are still working on an old tape. We ain't even get to CD yet. We're working on an old cassette tape that talks about why trials, particularly clinical trials, are bad for us. So hopefully we'll be able to get into that discussion. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all today.
Thank you so much. We are so grateful you're here. This is great. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and ask Dr. Terrell. So what is clinical trials? What is the whole essence of getting diversity in clinical trials? Why do we have to have it?
So I'm gonna start my comments actually by giving credit. If you look at the topic for our discussion today, in full disclosure, that was created in mind or listening to Dr. Nguyen, who I've had the honor of listening to his brilliance on many occasions. And he is probably one of the smartest, most accomplished, down to earth. I could go on and on, people that I know. One of the things that
I would say the same thing about you, Dr. T.
One of the things that he said that I've always thought, I've always remembered, he said, if you're not seated at the table, you could end up on the menu. And that is kind of why we're here today, so we can figure out how we can stop being consumed on the menu and how we can take our place at the table. So when we talk about this, I'm going to go back a little bit and kind of start with what drove me to think that this is a topic that we really needed to discuss. So we all know, how we've been living the last 2 years. And, as the pandemic started, the virus starts, then, we need a vaccine. Right. And so then we start talking about the development of this vaccine. And then there's all these conversations about vaccine hesitancy. And when it started, the vaccine hesitancy was actually discussed in a more pejorative or negative way when it came to discussing vaccines within the Black community and other communities of color. And, there was a lot of kind of almost blaming the victim, there's a vaccine and why aren't you taking it? And so, it brought up these conversations about vaccine hesitancy. And eventually we evolved and kind of at some point pressed pause and stopped blaming the victim and started saying, okay, well, maybe there's some reasons why this hesitancy exists. And I think we'll get into that a little bit. So when we talk about, the vaccine, at one point we started trying to analyze, is this safe, and who made up this clinical trial when Moderna first started testing for the vaccine. And right. I think this is probably the most public conversation that we've had in recent time about the need for diversity in trials. And what happened when Moderna started their trials, at one point they realized they only had about 7% of Black participants in their trial, compared to the 13% of Black citizens who make up the US population. So we weren't, adequately represented in the trials. And to their credit, I have to give them credit that they actually halted the trials and said, let's pause and see if we can get more Black participants in particular, so that the numbers are actually more representative of what happens in, our population. And then as Pfizer developed their trials, they kind of followed suit. So they both ended up at about 10% of Black participants, or roughly around there, for their trials. Now, that doesn't happen in everyday medicine right now. It's actually not a requirement in order to gain FDA approval. You don't have to have a representative sample of participants in your trial. And we can debate that later about whether that's right or wrong. But the effect of that is that you don't have true representation when, treatments are recommended, or when drugs specifically are actually, launched and put on the market. To kind of roll that back into data and statistics, at one point, the National Cancer Institute looked at the involvement, especially of young Black cancer patients, aged like 20 to 39 over a 15-year period, from 2000 to 2015. And they found that the number of enrollees in clinical trials was less than 3%. And if you singled out Black men, it was even lower. And then if you take that and kind of fast forward, so there was a period where we weren't invited into trials. That's a whole nother subject.
I would like to talk about that period as well. Give us because I think that's what triggers the whole non-trusting issue. Mm-hmm. Give us a history. Give us a history of why we couldn't trust. And when I say we, African Americans and Blacks are not literally particularly interested in participating in clinical trials. Given all the past, give us the past issues that we have actually experienced.
So if we're talking about history, this is Black History Month. So, what we're supposed to do with Black History Month is acknowledge our history and use that to figure out how we put ourselves in a better place in the future. So I think what you're asking is, if we talk about some of the history that caused us not to want to participate in trials, okay, let's start there. And if we really want to start there, we got to go all the way back to 1619. There's some folk out there now who get really scared when we say 1619. But if we start at 1619, that's actually when this started. When the slaves were first brought over, the first thing they did was started using them as subjects for medical education and to build the U.S. medical education system. It gives us a really good account of the abuses in medicine. And one of the things that they highlight is that the Southern medical schools actually advertised that they had an abundance of anatomical material, AKA slaves. And just to think about that they called the anatomical material. We weren't even humans. The next, reiteration of this atrocities was actually this concept of resurrectionists, where the Medical College of Georgia, and I think the Virginia Medical College was another one, that actually employed people to actually go and dig up the remains of slaves. And then they got savvy and crafty and even enlisted Black slaves to go to the cemeteries to do it, because they thought that would yield less suspicion coming into because those were Black cemeteries, because we couldn't just be buried anywhere. So a white person going into the Black cemetery would raise suspicion. So they would actually go and employ people to dig up the remains. And those are, so that's early on. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of attention that's put on Tuskegee, and more recently, the whole discussion about Henrietta Lacks and the use of her cancer cells that were used to make advances in immunology and oncology, and even the polio vaccine, without ever giving any monies to, her descendants. Even if we look at the whole concept of sterilization in the country and how disproportionately that affected African Americans to the point that the eugenist that kind of started it in California, which was the most sterilizations, what he created was actually the model that they used in Nazi Germany. We want to always say that, all the bad stuff happened in Germany and those were bad people, but they used the model that we created here. And then, the modern father of obstetrics and gynecology, Dr. Sims, and that's another one that's kind of been brought up.
Yeah.
Recently, that, he basically, operated on patients without anesthesia, misused enslaved women for his own medical purposes. And then on top of that, after he used them, Then he said, okay, now I want you to come work in my clinic. It wasn't enough that I used you. Now I'm going to get even more out of you and actually put you to work. And some of these practices, especially some of this covert, I would call it, sterilization practices. In some places, this wasn't just a 17th, 18th century thing. This was into the 1980s and going forward.
Right.
And I think, we can all, kind of attest to modern day things that have been done, even if you look at what is offered, to patients in terms of treatment. And that's a whole nother discussion. But I think
access to health too, right?
Exactly. And so when we really stop and say, what's behind all of this, all of those things that I listed, and there's, tons, unfortunately, there are tons more examples of what has been done historically that created this basis of mistrust, skepticism. And so when we say that, like I said, there was a point where we weren't being invited into clinical trials. And now that we've been invited, because now they're starting to say, well, maybe we should at least reach out. And so I think this history explains and shows why we have good reason to be skeptical and to ask questions and take a moment to pause and think about what it is. But then to Dr. Nguyen's point, there's history, and we know what the history is, but then we have to try to figure out how we move past that. And so, we have to not just know the history, but we also have to know what advances have been made since the time of 1619 and since Tuskegee that makes it so that it's actually illegal, to do experiments on people, and that things that have been put in place so there's actually financial repercussions when people don't do the right thing. And I'm going to stop on that and see if Dr. Nguyen wants to chime in.
I'll bring Dr. Nguyen in, but I'm going to go back to you later on to touch on, well, actually for both of you, to touch on the African side and the continent, the side of the continent, what's going on. And over there's nobody really, unlike here in US, who speaks up for them. Indirectly, they're being used every day for clinical trials. It's a dumping ground for a lot of things. But Dr. Nguyen, please come on in.
I wanted to, first of all, thank Dr. Terrell, because that's not a history that most people are even aware of.
Right.
And the issue of, using our body parts to, quote, advance science that didn't advance all people, but only stood to advance some, is something that shouldn't have happened then, but certainly won't be happening as we move forward. Having said that, though, as we think about what we know about what's happening on the continent of Africa, we also understand that now that big pharma companies are moving in, they're also are doing things like, for example, making certain that are we getting the same quality, right? Because it's not just about access, it's about quality. So when you're getting the chemotherapy, I'm actually challenging everyone to recognize that there have been reports and by, people like Otis Brawley and others who, blew the whistle about a few years back when he was at the American Cancer Society, of this use of, sort of diluting the chemotherapy. That's
interesting. Yes, it's so true.
The 2 drugs or the 3 drugs regimen that we would use here, but saying, well, it's in Africa. And we always, chalk it up, well, they don't have any money. Well, listen, the funny part about diversity, I've learned, is when there's a ton of money, there ain't still enough money to do the right thing. And so when there ain't no money, you always fall back on, well, we ain't got no money. If we had money, we would. But the funny part is, when you get money, it seems like we still don't do the right thing. So I've actually now changed my tack and sort of saying it's about the right thing, not sometime, but it's just simply about the right thing. Always. And so as we're starting to think about pharma companies and clinical trials, in particularly in Africa, particularly in Nigeria and Uganda and Rwanda and many other places. There is going to have to be what I think an understanding that a balance, the fact that clinical trials are really an extension now of the continuum of care. In fact, there's some papers written that, at least in the United States now, I can only quote the data here, that those people who are at hospitals that are doing clinical trials tend to have a better outcome.
Mm.
And you might say, is it the clinical trials? Kind of, but what it really means is the organizational capability to put on clinical trials that enable you to have extra pair of eyes on you and other things that ultimately result in your better outcome. So we need to stop playing about these things. So yes, in Africa, am I worried? I got my eye on Africa, as we are now sort of saying there are rules and regulations that you might have to do in the United States, on the south side of Chicago, on the east side of Richmond, that some folks think that when you cross the Atlantic, that those rules don't apply. And what we're going to ask is that everybody in every country of Africa keep aware and keep people honest that as we are doing trials, we're doing the right trials, we're doing the right trials the right way.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Perfectly well said. And so to really, I know with the issue with COVID, to me, woke me up, which is why I'm doing this show, and all the vaccine issues and stuff. Where are we now with that? Do we, aside from Johnson & Johnson, where are we as Africans, as Black, nations? How far have we come in participating to the clinical trials?
Well, here's again where, not to get with Lumumba and Patrice Lumumba and all the rest of them talk about the Pan-African movement that was in 1945. So I ain't gonna even try to go there, but I am gonna say the following, that there was once upon a time that we thought that we shouldn't be people being impacted, but we should be the people impacting. This is why I will go with my last breath saying it ain't enough for us to be participants in trial. We need to create the next generation of people from Chad, from Nigeria, from Zimbabwe, from Botswana, from South Side Chicago, from DC, who are at the table creating the places and spaces for the science to be done to answer the questions that are impacting our community. Right. When we still look today that the fact that we look at who are running your clinical trials, predominantly it is not us. Who are designing the next generation of therapies, it is in general not us. Who is actually looking at big data? And the reality is we talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning. And what makes me laugh is just like the vaccine. People say, well, I don't want nobody to put that vaccine in because then they're gonna know where I am. Man, please, as long as you got a cell phone, they already know where you at and where you sleeping. So, and then they say, well, I turn off my cell phone at night. Please act like turning it off. Give me a break. But the reality is we are not in a place where we're collecting that data, controlling that data, and using that data for brown folk throughout the globally that we're collating and putting together for our benefit. So only message I have is that as more of us are getting on the trials and more of us are figuring out that not having the vaccine is probably not a great idea, I would actually challenge us that the 21st century, the next move is to say, yep, we know the problem, but how are we going to put all Black and tan folk up in there to make the difference, to create?
You brought a good point, because the majority of people that I'm interviewing on the side for this show, and they're like, well, look at this vaccine. It's not really meant for us. It's for this. They're trying to trick us. I'm like, well, that's why we need to be on the table to then understand if
at the table, you are on the menu, traditionally being carved up. So quit playing with me about the fact that just because you don't believe it, don't mean it ain't gonna happen to you.
And on the vaccine topic, the one thing that I heard a lot through all of this that I think has relevance to our conversation today, and people would say, oh, I'm not getting the vaccine because I don't want to be experimented on. And I have two answers to that. So the first is, if you come into the hospital and you have COVID and you're so sick that you have to be hospitalized, which By the way, as an aside, that's the real reason for the vaccine. It's not to keep you from getting COVID. The real reason for the vaccine was to keep you from getting so sick that you'd either need to be in the hospital and to keep you from dying. That's really what the vaccine is for. So all those who don't get the vaccine and then end up in the hospital and then end up being very, very ill, what's the first thing that happens to them? They get an experimental drug, right? Because we're trying to keep you alive. So you say, I don't want experimental drugs, but then the minute you get in there, give me everything you got. Give me whatever you got, as long as I can live. That's number one. And number two, if we take this back a step away from COVID and just look at everyday life, okay? And again, the argument, I don't want experimental drugs. So when the latest high blood pressure drug or the latest diabetes drug comes out on the market and your doctor says, I want you to try this new drug, that's an experimental drug for you. You know why? Because there weren't enough people that looked like you that participated in the trials. So you are, in a sense, then taking an experimental drug, because most of our drugs, most of our treatments, and that's the point of our topic today, are not done in series where there are people who are representative of our numbers in the population. So until we get to the point where we're in the trials, we're in the research, we're going to be in this experimental state of being until our numbers are representative.
Right. It's very, very important. Yes, go ahead. You want to chime in on that, Dr. Nguyen?
Yeah, I was going to say, we need to stop playing. We know more about what's in the vaccine than what most people eat when you eat that peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Or a hot dog. How about a hot dog?
How about the hot dog, right?
So quit playing as if this is, first of all, we forget that as descendants of folk like Imhotep, we created the concepts and the frameworks of the first universities and the first science. In fact, when most people talk to me about, experiment, I said, you do understand that the first science experiments was carried out right in the Bible. But then, this is why you got the Daniel diet, by the way. Where he said, let us go back to a diet to see if by using that diet, we can be what? Made better. So stop all the ridiculousness and the misinformation, disinformation coming from your Russian robots and all the rest of these things. Quit letting people get Jedi mind tricks on us when we know where we're supposed to be in this thinking. We were the originators of the whole concept of critical thinking. And what has happened with us, I think, through many things, colonization and God knows all the stuff, slavery and other things, we've lost our path in the ability of critical thinking.
Yeah.
So when someone tells me, I'm afraid of the vaccine, I say, you should be afraid of that hot dog you just ate. That's what you should be afraid of. There was more known in how the vaccine was made and more transparency about that. And by the way, if you didn't believe it in the first round, now that millions of people have it, there's not 3 heads growing out. There's not increased death. The increased death is the data, and the data, you can believe it or not, but the data said those who don't have the vaccine are dying at a 10 times higher level than those who have received the vaccine. Now, if it takes you to, I always say there's 3 kinds of people, and I'm gonna shut up after this. 3 kinds of people.
Okay.
There's 3 kinds of kids, I used to say. Well, my grandmother was, she gonna do that. There's 3 kinds of kids. There's the kids I could tell the stove is hot, and if you put your hand on the flyer, it's gonna burn. And you'd be like, all right, well, that's enough information for me. She goes, the second kind of kid is, I'll tell you, the stove is hot. And in reality, if you put your hand in the fire, you'll get burnt. But what you need to do is that kid needs to probably just put his hand around the fire. Oh, it feels hot. She goes, but then there's the third one. That third one don't believe nothing until they put their hand in the fire and then it gets burned. And all of a sudden they're like, that fire was hot. Which of these people do we want to be? And consistently, I'm asking the question and challenging all African Americans and all Africans throughout the globe, just like we did back in the National African Congress in 1945. Who are we in the context of our ability of critical thinking, asking the right questions, right? Not always believing what we hear, but being critical in the information. That's important.
So then how do we solve that? You know, with that, let's say that first person who to every average brown, black, community will say, well, he is gullible, they're gonna use him. How do we pass that then? How do we educate? As our forefathers say, the re-education of a Negro, and I say the re-education of all Africans.
The single person who has a high school education or above, that's who gets invited. Now we can, I don't see how, if you have a disease and you didn't go to you didn't have formal education beyond high school, that doesn't negate your cells from being worthy of being in a trial. That doesn't erase your existence as a person who could contribute, valuable information to how something works. And I would actually argue that might make you even more valuable in the assessment of treatments. But those kinds of things, I think when you look at the research that's done, we have to call a spade when we do these trials. So, I think sickle cell is an obvious example, but I will use that. So if you're doing a drug treatment or trial for sickle cell, and 70% of your participants are not Black, then you need to start over. So we have to know the diseases. We need to know the conditions that we're actually, testing for, and make those trials representative of what we're trying to accomplish. If we look at multiple myeloma, 20% of people who have multiple myeloma are Black. So, just now I'm starting to see more, research studies that talk about, involvement of Black patients in trials and research for multiple myeloma. But I think those kinds of things, need to be addressed. I mentioned that right now, it's not required to have representation of all peoples in your trials or in your research to get FDA approval. That's something that the government needs to step in and say, this is important, this affects outcomes, and we're going to mandate that you have representation in order to gain approval for your drug or treatment. And I think the last thing, even though anybody who knows me knows that social media and that whole platform is so not me. I did a talk earlier this week, and I had to call my niece because it was Instagram Live, and I won't even go into how that upset my soul and my whole day trying to get on Instagram Live for this talk. But I do know the importance of social media, despite all of my antiquated ways. And so now when we look at, entities that represent certain diseases, if it's the American Diabetes Association or whatever, the Lymphoma Association or what have you, those entities now are using their social media platforms to reach out to patients. So that's another way of getting information to people that need that information. And then also, again, I'm a borrow from Dr. Wynn, because that's when you hear people and they know what they're talking about, you're supposed to pass on that knowledge. So one of the things I admire about Dr. Wynn and the research that he's done is that he has gone to where people are. So he will tell you about going to barbershops and things. And so when we're looking at this whole issue of clinical trials and research, the majority of that has been done in large academic medical centers. And so if that's the only place where we're recruiting, we're going to miss people who may go to a community health center or who get the majority of their care at a local community hospital, or who don't trust the big academic centers.